They said wild animals never ask for help, but in the frozen stillness of an everpine morning, a dying bobcat named Juniper broke that rule. She didn't growl, she didn't flee, she lay quietly in a dumpster, starving, pregnant, alone. And as Dr. Maren Ashford knelt beside her, no one could have guessed that this silent cry for help would save not just one life, but four. What happened next? Some call it instinct. Maren calls it a miracle. You decide. The town of Everpine lay hushed beneath a quilt of December snow, the kind that muffled even the heartbeat of the pines. It was early morning, just past 6, and the sky was still bruised with deep cobalt, save for a faint golden rim along the edge of the Rockies. The streets were empty save for plumes of smoke spiraling from chimneys and the occasional yawn of an old pickup engine. Cold Hollow Lane, where the Pinefall Veterinary Clinic stood, was blanketed in silence. Almost Dr. Maren Ashford braced against the wind as she stepped out the back door of the clinic, a worn burlap scarf tied tightly around her neck. At 33, Maren carried herself with a blend of quiet strength and perpetual fatigue, as if the world weighed a little heavier on her than most. Her raven-black hair was twisted into a practical bun, and her gray eyes held that unmistakable shade of knowing the kind carved from years of witnessing life on the edge. She had returned to her hometown only 4 months ago, after spending 6 years in Montana working with injured wildlife. A failed rescue during an avalanche had haunted her, since a snow leopard she had once cared for had died in her arms when the transport was delayed. Since then, something inside her had folded inward. Now standing in the pre-dawn cold behind her modest clinic, her boots crunching over frostbitten gravel, she dragged 2 heavy garbage bags toward the dumpster. The wind howled between buildings, and the bitter air stung her cheeks like needles. She muttered under her breath, regretting the choice of her thin work coat instead of the thermal one hanging untouched in her office. The only sound was the rustle of plastic and the hiss of snowflakes brushing against the metal siding. Then she heard it. It wasn't a bark or the yowl of a stray house cat. It was deeper, more primal, a low, raspy growl that didn't belong anywhere near town. Maren froze. The sound came from behind the dumpster. Her fingers tightened around the garbage bags before she set them down slowly, as if afraid the plastic crinkle would trigger something unseen. She reached into her coat pocket for her phone and switched on the flashlight. A beam of light cut through the dark. "Hello." She called out, her voice tight, her breath visible in the frigid air. No reply, only silence. Then, another growl, fainter this time. Carefully, Maren stepped toward the sound, her boots leaving deep tracks in the untouched snow. She approached the tall green dumpster, her heart thudding against her ribs. As she reached the edge and raised the light, what she saw rooted her in place: a bobcat, large, wild, unmistakable. It was curled low among torn garbage bags and broken cardboard boxes, golden eyes gleaming under the flashlight. The creature's coat was mottled gray and cream patchy in places, revealing skin beneath. Its breathing was labored, and one front paw was held awkwardly off the ground. It didn't snarl, didn't leap or run. It just stared. "God," Maren whispered, "you're not supposed to be here." Her eyes swept over the animal with clinical instinct. Female judging by the size and the subtle contours. Malnourished, clearly dehydrated and wounded. Probably 4 to 5 years old. She thought. Every muscle in Maren's body screamed caution. This was a wild predator, but the bobcat didn't move. That stillness frightened her, more than if it had lunged. It was too weak. In that moment, training and instinct collided. She should call wildlife control protocol dictated that, but the nearest center was 2 hours away, and in this weather longer. And this creature, this magnificent broken thing, might not survive that weight. Maren took a step back, pulling her phone to call her colleague, but stopped short when a sudden rustling in the trees behind the clinic caught her attention. She turned sharply. Reed Calloway emerged from the edge of the tree line, his gloved hands tucked into the front of his heavy ranger jacket, snow clinging to the laces of his boots. Reed was 37 tall and broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard that made him look older than his age. His eyes, the color of overcast skies, were constantly alert, born from years of patrolling Everpine's forest borders. A scar ran jagged across his left wrist, a reminder of a long-ago rescue gone wrong. He wasn't much of a talker, but those who knew him would vouch for his loyalty and patience, especially with wild things. "I heard something over the radio," he said, nodding toward the woods. "Found tracks leading down the ridge, ended here. Maren motioned toward the dumpster. "She's in bad shape, hurt and starving. I was just about to sedate her and bring her inside." Reed frowned. "A bobcat, this far into town." "She didn't wander here by accident," Maren said. "Something drove her out. Hunger maybe, or loss of territory." Reed's gaze drifted to the wounded animal, then back to Maren. "You're taking her in?" Maren nodded. "Unless you're here to stop me." Reed hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I've seen worse decisions." Together they moved quickly. Maren retrieved a thick wool blanket, a transport crate, and a syringe loaded with a mild sedative. As Reed held the flashlight steady, Maren approached the dumpster again, speaking softly. "Juniper," she whispered. The name came out of nowhere, but it felt right. "That's what I'll call you." The bobcat let out a weak huff as Maren gently draped the blanket over her, shielding her eyes from the light. She didn't resist. With Reed's help, they maneuvered Juniper into the crate. The lack of struggle chilled them both. Back inside the clinic, Maren prepared the examination room. By the time the sun began to rise, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered town, the wild cat was resting under warm lights. A drip line in her leg and her breathing stabilized. Maren sat beside her, brushing away a fleck of blood from Juniper's fur. "She's not just lost," she murmured. "She's holding on for something." Reed, standing by the window, looked out over the town. "You think she's alone?" "I don't know yet," Maren replied, "but she came here for a reason." He nodded. "Once I'll check the ridge again tomorrow, see if there are more signs." Maren smiled faintly. "Thanks, Reed." Outside, snow began to fall again, quietly covering the old tracks, as if nature wanted to hide all signs that something wild had dared to reach out for help. Inside the warmth of Pinefall Veterinary Clinic, the sterile scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing faintly with the earthy smell of wet fur and snowmelt. The early light filtered through frosted windows as Dr. Maren Ashford stood over the stainless steel examination table, her fingers hovering lightly above the sedated body of the bobcat she had just named Juniper. The name still echoed in her head as if it had been waiting all along to be spoken. Juniper lay still, her side rising and falling in slow, heavy rhythm. Under the soft glow of the surgical lamp, her mottled fur looked even thinner, the ridges of her ribs more pronounced. The injury to her left foreleg was evident now. A puncture wound surrounded by inflamed tissue partly scabbed over, but still leaking faint traces of pus. Maren leaned closer, brushing back the fur gently to assess the wound. Infection had begun to set and perhaps several days old. She injected a mild local anesthetic near the site before beginning to clean it. As she worked, her thoughts kept drifting to the wilderness that surrounded Everpine. What had driven Juniper into town, a shortage of prey, encroaching development, or something more unusual. Bobcats didn't usually get this close to humans unless forced. She applied a layer of antibiotic ointment, wrapped the leg carefully in gauze, and adjusted the IV line feeding fluids into Juniper's body. In the silence that followed, Maren opened the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet inside. Stacked beneath surgical towels and syringes was an old leather-bound notebook. She paused, then pulled it free. Its cover was weathered, the edges fraying, but the initials W.H. were still clearly etched on the front. Walter Hemsley, her late mentor, and the man who had first taught her to listen to the silences between an animal's breath. Walter had passed away 3 years ago, a quiet heart attack in the same cabin where he'd once patched up a fox with only a flashlight and a bottle of iodine. He had left the clinic to Maren in his will, something that had both honored and terrified her. She hadn't opened this notebook since returning to Everpine. Now she opened it slowly, the smell of old ink and field notes rushing up to meet her. Page after page was filled with Walter's slanted looping script entries, dated back 20 years. She flipped through until her fingers stopped on a passage marked Winter CO3. Her eyes narrowed, found female lynx near riverbed, severely underweight, took refuge behind fish shed, injured forelimb, held close to body, did not attempt to flee, left rear paw scarred. Pregnant eyes, amber gold, Maren's pulse quickened. The similarities were eerie, the timing, the symptoms, the behavior. Even the color of the eyes. Juniper had a faint scar along her left rear paw, exactly as Walter had described. Was it possible that Juniper was descended from that very lynx? That memory captured in Walter's fading ink felt like a thread reaching across time. The clinic's front bell jingled, suddenly snapping her out of the moment. She closed the notebook quickly, tucking it back in the drawer before washing her hands and heading into the lobby. A woman stood at the reception desk, bundled in a patchwork wool coat, with a crimson scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Her face was long and lean, with soft lines around her eyes and lips, from decades of squinting into sun and smiling at strangers. She was in her late 60s with tightly braided silver hair tucked under a knitted hat. Her name was Cora Braith, the town's unofficial historian and owner of the antique bookstore down the road. Maren Cora said, her voice light with curiosity. "I was walking to open the shop and saw Reed's truck out back. Everything all right?" Maren smiled politely. "Unusual visitor, a bobcat, actually injured and—" "Staying with me for now?" Cora's eyes sparkled. "Wild things always find their way to this clinic. Walter once told me that, he believed the mountains whisper to their own kind when help is needed." Maren nodded slowly. Maybe he was right. Cora placed a small brown parcel on the counter. "Thought you might need this? I found it cleaning out the shop basement. It belonged to Walter. I think it's another journal, might be useful." Maren took the package gently. "Thank you, Cora." "Really?" As Cora left, the warmth she brought lingered for a moment longer. Maren placed the parcel aside and returned to the treatment room. Juniper still lay quiet, though her ears twitched at the sound of Maren's footsteps. That was a good sign. Sensory awareness was returning. Maren sat beside the table, scribbling notes into her current case file. Vitals stabilized, fluids, effective infection, controlled for now. Estimated weight, 60% of healthy adult abdomen, slightly distended. Possible internal swelling. She frowned her hand, pausing. Carefully, she laid her palm along Juniper's belly, feeling the soft warmth of fur beneath her fingertips. The abdominal cavity felt full, but not from bloating or fluid. Her brows furrowed. There was movement, faint, subtle, but unmistakable. She pressed slightly deeper. A flutter, then another. Oh, she breathed, sitting back. Slowly, Juniper was pregnant. Of course, that explained the desperation. The risk. The reason for leaving the safety of the trees and venturing into the edge of humanity. Not just survival, maternal instinct. Protect not just herself, but the life she carried. Maren stood up, heart racing. This changed everything. She would need to monitor fetal movement, prepare a den enclosure, adjust medication dosage, and most of all, she would need time, something the wild didn't often allow. She looked back at Juniper, who now watched her with those same amber gold eyes Walter had described so long ago. For a moment, they stared at each other, vet and wild thing, both tethered by something fragile and ancient. Outside, the sun had finally crested the ridge. A shaft of light broke through the clouds, spilling golden warmth onto the snow. Maren stood quietly, the weight of responsibility and wonder pressing equally on her shoulders. Inside that treatment room, a new story had begun, not just of rescue, but of legacy. The snow had settled heavier overnight, blanketing the rooftops and bending the pine branches of everpine under its soft weight. Morning came with a quiet stubbornness, the pale sun barely managing to cast any warmth over the brittle stillness. Inside Pinefall Veterinary Clinic, the glow of the treatment room lights provided a fragile contrast to the winter beyond. Dr. Maren Ashford, running on less than 4 hours of sleep, cradled a mug of black coffee while watching Juniper breathe steadily in her enclosure. The bobcat had improved slightly. Her breathing was less labored, and the inflammation around her wounded leg had begun to subside. But it was the faint ripples of life beneath her belly that haunted Maren, the unborn lives depending on the wild mother's survival. She had spent the early dawn hours reviewing wildlife gestation patterns and neonatal protocols. If all went well, Juniper would deliver in a matter of weeks. If it didn't, a knock at the back door broke her focus. Maren stepped into the hallway, wiping her hands on a towel, and opened the door to find Reed Calloway, backlit by snow and bundled in a thick ranger's coat. He looked taller than usual against the narrow doorway, his cheeks ruddy from the cold and snow still melting in his beard. "Morning," he greeted, his voice low, almost cautious. Maren raised an eyebrow. Back already, Reed stepped inside and shook the snow off his boots. "Got a report this morning from a woman on Hemlock Lane. Said her cat's been on edge for days. She found claw marks near the shed. Figured I'd stop by, see how your guest is doing." "She's stable," Maren said, leading him toward the treatment room. "But there's more. She's pregnant." Reed stopped mid-step. "Seriously?" Maren nodded, opening the door slowly to avoid startling Juniper, who lay curled under a heat lamp. Reed stepped closer, his brow creasing as he took in the wild animal stretched over the bedding. He folded his arms silent for a long moment. "That explains a lot," he finally said. "I've seen predators desperate before, but coming this far into town. She wasn't just looking for food, she was looking for shelter." "Exactly," Maren said. "I don't think she had a choice." Reed turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You're planning to keep her here until she delivers. She won't survive a transfer right now. And even if she did, those cubs might not." Maren met his gaze. "I know it's risky, but I won't let her die on a technicality." Reed studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then I'll help. I've got experience with tracking and containment. And I think this is worth doing." Maren blinked, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Thank you." Reed shrugged. "Just don't make me do paperwork." They shared a small laugh, one that settled something unspoken between them. Outside, the sun inched higher, turning the snow from gray to glimmering white. Later that afternoon, as Maren was sanitizing the surgical table, the clinic's front bell jingled sharply. She walked into the lobby to find a young boy standing alone, clutching something swaddled in a flannel jacket. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his oversized parka dragged at his wrists. He looked about 10 with tousled blonde hair that stuck out from beneath a knit beanie and a freckled nose that crinkled when he sniffled. "I need help," he said, his voice high and earnest. "Please." Maren approached carefully. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Toby Winthrop," he replied, lowering the bundle slightly. "And this is Nimbus. He fell out of a tree and I think his wing's broken." Maren gently took the bundle and unwrapped it. Inside was a young snowy owl no more than a few months old, its left wing splayed awkwardly and its amber eyes wide with pain and fear. The feathers were matted with blood near the joint. "This happened yesterday," Toby added quickly. "He was just on the ground by our chicken coop. I stayed up all night trying to feed him bits of ham." Maren smiled gently. "You did the right thing bringing him here. He's hurt, but I think we can help." Toby looked up at her, his blue eyes rimmed with hope and exhaustion. "You're not going to send him away, right?" Maren hesitated only for a breath. "No, he'll stay with me for now." A wave of relief washed over the boy's face. "Can I visit him? I'll be real quiet. He's my only friend." There was something about the way he said it, too. Grown for his age, like someone who had been alone too often. Maren crouched down to meet his eyes. "You can visit any time you want, Toby, and I'll show you how to help care for him if you'd like." Toby nodded eagerly. "Thank you, Dr. Maren." As he left, she watched him bounce down the front steps and disappear into the snowlighter. Then when he arrived, back in the treatment room, Reed was still beside Juniper's enclosure, writing something in a notepad. Maren walked over with Nimbus in her hands. "We've got another patient," she said. Reed glanced up. "What happened to him?" "Broken wing. Probably fell from a perch or got spooked mid-flight." She laid the owl gently onto a padded tray and began prepping supplies. "His name's Nimbus, brought in by a boy named Toby." Reed raised an eyebrow. "The Winthrops up near the old sawmill." "Probably," Maren said. He said the owl's only friend. Reed was silent for a moment. "Poor kid." As Maren cleaned and inspected the fracture, the quiet between them was filled not with tension, but with a kind of shared rhythm. Two people working separately, but toward the same fragile purpose, restoring what had been broken. By dusk, Nimbus had been stabilized, his wing braced and bandaged, and Juniper was still sleeping peacefully. Toby returned just before closing, peeking through the glass and offering a shy wave. Maren let him in and showed him the small enclosure she had set up for Nimbus in a quiet corner of the clinic. The boy sat cross-legged beside it, whispering stories to the owl, as if casting spells of protection. Maren stood in the doorway watching them and felt something settle deep inside her chest, a thread perhaps tugging between the wild and the willing, between survival and gentleness, between the broken and those who dared to care. The wind howled down from the mountains that night, like a warning from the old gods. Icy, relentless, and ancient everpine was nearly motionless beneath the storm, as if the snow and silence had struck a deal to freeze time. For a while, Dr. Maren Ashford sat alone in the back office of Pine Fall Veterinary Clinic, a portable monitor glowing softly in front of her. On the screen, the bobcat Juniper was beginning to stir. Juniper lay in the specially prepared den enclosure Maren had fashioned in the isolation room, a dark, warm corner shielded by thick wool blankets. hay bedding, and a low-red heat lamp. The setup had been modeled after natural dens, using notes from wildlife rehabilitation, manuals and old entries. In Walter Hemsley's journal, Juniper's breathing had become labored, her body twitching in irregular spasms. The kittens were coming. Maren reached for her notebook and pen, but paused watching instead as Juniper shifted and stretched out fully for the first time in hours. She hadn't touched food since midday, and her water bowl remained barely disturbed. The signs were unmistakable contractions, nesting behavior, frequent licking. She was in early labor. Maren exhaled slowly and sipped from a now cold cup of chamomile tea. The clinic was quiet. Nimbus. The snowy owl slept soundly in his enclosure, and young Toby Winthrop had gone home long after sunset. Reluctantly, Reed Calloway, who had stayed late to help clean out storage, now leaned quietly against the wall near the door, arms crossed, watching Maren rather than the screen. "She's started," Maren said, eyes still fixed on the monitor. Reed stepped forward, his boots soft on the tile floor. "How long does it take? With bobcats, it varies. First delivery can be slow, but I'm hoping her instincts kick in once it begins." The room fell into silence, broken only by the low whir of the monitor fan. Reed pulled a chair beside her and sat down with a small sigh. His face, usually composed and weathered, looked softer in the glow of the monitor. His voice was low and distant when he finally spoke. "I haven't been this close to a wild birth since I was a kid." He said, "Not since—" "Well, it's been a while." Maren glanced sideways. "You sound like that's not entirely a good thing." Reed didn't answer right away. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather coin pouch, rolling it between his fingers as he spoke. "My brother Cal used to raise hawks," he said. "We were both obsessed with wildlife. You know, Dad hated it. Said wild things belonged in wild places. But Cal, he had a gift. He could train a falcon like it was second nature. When I was 15, he took me deep into the woods near Devil's Spine to release a red-tailed hawk he'd rehabilitated. Only we didn't realize there were black bears in that area." Reed's hands stilled. "We startled a mother. She had cubs. It happened so fast. I ran. Cal didn't." Maren looked at him, her heart catching in her throat. "He didn't make it." Reed said simply, "I blamed wildlife for years. Promised myself I'd never care for something wild again." The monitor beeped once, on screen. Juniper shifted again, curling her hind legs in a way Maren had seen before in feral cats. It was beginning. Reed stood up quickly as if the memory had made the air too heavy to sit in. He walked to the door, but paused. "Then I saw you," he said quietly, with that cat in a blanket whispering to her like she was a scared child. "And I realized, maybe wild things find the right people when they need them." Maren didn't speak. She didn't need to. Their silence, layered with pain and gentleness, said more than words could. Hours passed. Juniper labored through the storm, her body tense and still, then shaking, then still again. Maren watched every twitch and breath through the camera, refusing to go in, unless absolutely necessary. Reed returned with strong coffee, handed her a mug without a word, and sat by her side again. At 3:07 a.m., the first kitten arrived. Maren covered her mouth with one hand as she watched the small, wet form wriggle toward its mother. Juniper licked it methodically, cleaning it, stimulating its lungs to breathe. A tiny squeak filled the speakers. 29 minutes later, the second kitten emerged, followed shortly by a third smaller one with a barely visible tail stub, possibly a congenital defect or an injury in utero. Maren tensed, but Juniper continued to care for all three with gentle urgency. They latched onto her belly and began to nurse. Reed leaned forward. "She's doing it." Maren nodded. They all made it weak, but breathing. For the next half hour they sat in reverent silence, watching Juniper curl protectively around her kittens. Her golden eyes flickered once toward the camera, then closed. At last she rested. Maren looked at Reed. "I'm naming them tomorrow. You're keeping them until they're strong enough to be released." "Yes." Reed smiled faintly. "What about the one with the tail stub? Maybe she stays longer," Maren said softly. "Maybe she stays forever." Outside, the blizzard had begun to calm, and the wind softened to whispers. The trees surrounding Everpine groaned and settled as the storm broke into silence. Within the clinic, the warmth of the birthing room felt almost sacred. the screen displayed a quiet moment, Juniper breathing in rhythm with the fragile life that now nestled against her. In that moment, nothing else existed, just resilience, motherhood, and a kind of quiet miracle unfolding in the heart of a storm. The days following the birth were slow, snow-laden, and fragile, like frost on a window pane, beautiful but easy to shatter. Pinefall Veterinary Clinic transformed into a kind of sanctuary where time moved, according to instinct rather than clocks. Within the dimly lit isolation room, Juniper nursed her 3 newborns beneath the soft halo of a heat lamp. Maren Ashford rose early every morning, before sunrise, tiptoeing through the quiet building to check on her unlikely patient, and the mewling lives pressed close to her. The kittens were growing, though, at different paces. The largest, a female, with a patch of reddish fur over her right eye, was the boldest, always the first to wiggle free from the tangle to explore. The second, smaller and almost entirely gray, was calmer, more observant. And the runt, stubby-tailed and delicate, remained close to Juniper's belly, her tiny chest fluttering like a moth's wings. Juniper, though still weary, had embraced her role with quiet fierceness. She tolerated Maren's presence more and more, occasionally lifting her head when the vet adjusted the water or bedding. Trust came in glances in the absence of growls, in eyes that no longer burned with panic, but something more ancient vigilance perhaps, or the knowing patience of mothers. Each morning after the kittens had been checked, fed, weighed, and recorded, Maren would move to the front room and unlock the glass door just as the first light broke over the pine-draped ridges. Without fail, a small figure would appear minutes later, trudging through the snow-banked sidewalk, oversized boots kicking clumps of slush. Toby Winthrop had become a fixture, 10 years old, face ruddy from the cold. He wore a different colored beanie every day, most handmade, most slightly crooked. Nimbus. The owl responded to his voice more than any other stimulus, even blinking more frequently when Toby entered the room. He'd perch beside the owl's enclosure for hours, speaking in soft, half-whispered stories, tales of a magical forest of snow wolves that guided lost travelers home, of stars that sang to animals in their sleep. Maren noticed the boy's sketches growing more detailed, his lines more confident, colors more expressive. One morning, he came with a roll of brown paper, clutched tightly in his mittened hands. "I drew them," he said simply, "Juniper and her babies." Maren took the drawing and unrolled it carefully. It showed Juniper curled in a nest of straw, the 3 kittens nestled against her, and behind them, a towering pine forest that shimmered with silver stars. Above them was a red banner, hand-lettered in careful blocky handwriting. "Home can be quiet and wild." Something caught in Maren's throat. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice tight. "You can hang it in her room if you want," Toby offered shyly. Maren nodded. "I will." As Toby went back to Nimbus's enclosure, Maren stepped into the office and pinned the drawing above the observation window, where Juniper's resting form could be seen through the glass. She didn't know whether the bobcat noticed it, but somehow the room felt warmer. That afternoon, Reed Calloway arrived just before closing. He carried a shovel slung over one shoulder and a thermos in hand. He looked windburned and tired, his ranger uniform smudged with sap and snow, but his eyes were bright as ever. "Trail cleanup near Cathedral Pines," he said, setting the thermos down, fallen trees from the storm. Some of them looked claw-marked deep. Not. Bear. Maren raised a brow. "Mountain lion, could be," he replied. "Could also be a displaced male bobcat. If Juniper was pushed out, something larger may have moved into her territory. More reason for her to stay here longer." Reed nodded, then paused. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pale blue envelope crumpled slightly at the corners. He turned it over in his hand before handing it to her, without explanation. She read the return address aloud. "Calloway, Nevada." "My sister," Reed said, his voice oddly neutral. "Haven't spoken in 15 years. She tracked me down through the ranger registry." Maren watched him quietly waiting. "She wants to visit. Says she's tired of the silence, tired of the years." He looked away, jaw clenched. "But I'm not sure I'm ready. We didn't part well." "What happened?" Reed shrugged, but there was weight behind it. "She blamed me for Cal. Said I should have stayed. That I ran. And maybe I did. I never answered her letters after that. We just let the time do the forgetting." Maren stepped closer. "What does she say in this one? She forgives me, and I don't know if I forgive myself." Maren didn't speak right away. She glanced back at the window, where Juniper and her kittens slept peacefully in the artificial den. "You helped bring new life into the world, Reed," she said softly. "And you haven't run since." He nodded once, pocketing the letter again, still thinking. That evening, as the sun dipped below the snow-choked treetops, Maren updated the kitten's health charts while Toby hummed softly in the background and Nimbus preened in his straw nest. Juniper stretched slightly, curling her long body around the trio of cubs. Her breath steadied her eyes, half-lidded. Hope was slow here. It moved like thawing ice or sprouting lichen. Quiet, patient, a little wild, but it was here growing. The first signs of spring were whispered rather than sung. Snowbanks shrank into dappled patches along the creek beds. Pine needles reappeared beneath the slush, and birdsong, hesitant and thin, began returning to Everpine. At Pine Fall Veterinary Clinic, new life stirred not only in the forest, but within the walls of the modest building, where wildness had found brief sanctuary. Inside the isolation room, Juniper's coat had begun to reclaim its luster. Once patchy and dull, her fur now shone with the healthy sheen of a creature restored. The wound on her foreleg had healed into a fine silver scar. She moved more fluidly now, quieter, more confident, and she had begun to teach. Maren watched from the camera monitor as Juniper demonstrated basic stalking motions to her 3 kittens weaving through hay and old tree limbs Maren and Reed had placed in the enclosure. The largest kitten mirrored her, exactly crouching and pouncing, while the runt followed in small, clumsy hops, forever a step behind. But determined, even the observant middle sibling had begun swatting at falling bits of straw with curiosity. "It's time," Reed said one morning, standing in the threshold of the room with arms crossed, gazing through the glass. His ranger uniform was zipped to the neck, clean for once, his dark hair still damp from the shower. Maren nodded slowly. "Almost. A few more weeks, maybe. There's a clearing near Cedar Hollow," he continued. "Secluded, well-protected, limited human activity. It's within the West Ridge Conservation Zone. I've released injured foxes there before." "They did well?" Maren hesitated, fingers resting on the edge of the counter. "You think they'll survive?" Reed looked at her. "They've survived this far. That says something." Later that day, while Juniper curled around her sleeping cubs, Maren stood alone in the room, arms crossed, trying not to feel the ache already forming in her chest. She knelt beside the enclosure, speaking softly. "You came here half alive, Juniper, and now look at you. You brought them into this world. You kept going." The bobcat stirred slightly golden eyes, flickering open, landing on Maren, with a gaze that was neither wild nor tame, but something in between, an understanding that defied domestication. In another part of the clinic, Toby Winthrop was hard at work with his sleeves rolled up and his tongue poking slightly out in concentration. He was hunched over a wooden frame on the back porch, surrounded by tools, nails and scraps of weather-treated wood. "I think he's gonna like this," he said, gesturing toward the structure. "It's got airflow holes and everything. And see this part." He pointed at a small panel lined with feathers. "That's for quieting wind drafts, like a nest, but smarter." Maren knelt beside him. "Toby, this is incredible." Toby beamed, cheeks flushed from the cool air. "I read about owl flight rehab in this old birding book my grandpa left me. Nimbus will need space to practice gliding before he's ready for trees again." The small snowy owl, now nearly full-sized, watched from a perch nearby, his feathers fluffy, but his wings increasingly powerful. He had begun stretching them more frequently, and 2 days ago he had startled everyone by lifting off the ground in a shaky vertical leap before tumbling awkwardly into a stack of blankets. Progress. Maren laid a hand on Toby's shoulder. "He's lucky to have you." The boy shrugged, but there was pride in his eyes. "I think I'm lucky to have him too." That evening, as twilight painted the mountains in shades of rose and violet, Maren and Reed sat on the front steps of the clinic, sipping lukewarm coffee from mismatched mugs. "I still think it's too soon," Maren murmured. "I know they're wild, but it's like we've woven something together here, threads, quiet ones. If we cut them too early, they won't break," Reed said. "They'll just stretch. That's what the good ones do." Maren turned her gaze toward him. "You speaking from experience?" Reed smirked. "Maybe," she nudged him with her elbow. "You talked to your sister." Yet he looked down at his mug, then gave a small nod. "Called her last night." She cried. "I almost did." Almost I was raised by Stoics, remember? They both laughed and the laughter eased something in the silence. The following morning, Maren called the West Ridge Conservation Authority and scheduled an inspection of Cedar Hollow. Reed arranged for a wildlife release permit. The plan was made quietly, efficiently, but the weight of it hung over them like the fog that drifted through the trees that week. A few days later, Toby finished the wind shelter for Nimbus. It was sturdy, warm, and surprisingly elegant in its simplicity. Maren helped him place it inside a larger enclosure Reed had built from wire mesh and repurposed fencing. Nimbus was moved into the new space, blinking curiously as he stepped inside. Toby crouched at the edge. "You don't have to fly yet," he whispered. But soon, just like them, in the days that followed, Nimbus began gliding short distances between perches. The bobcat kittens climbed higher inside their own enclosure, pouncing more boldly, mimicking their mother's hunting techniques. Juniper stopped flinching when Maren entered the room. Everything was moving forward. Everything was preparing to leave. The morning of the release arrived, not with fanfare but with a soft hush that blanketed the pines in a pale, milky mist. The air in Everpine held that quiet tension that comes just before change, neither mournful nor jubilant, but reverent. As the sun slowly pushed above the horizon, the outlines of the trees blurred into tall shadows, and the gravel roads shimmered with dew that had not yet decided to become steam or frost. Inside Pinefall Veterinary Clinic, the isolation room felt strangely hollow. The straw in Juniper's enclosure had been cleaned one last time. The heat lamp, now switched off, cast no glow on the corner where she'd nursed her young. Juniper stood alert, lean and whole again. Her golden eyes bright with something deeper than instinct. Her 3 kittens darted around her legs, bold, careful, curious, each shaped by the quiet safety they'd known, each ready for the wilderness that waited. Maren Ashford leaned her arms against the doorframe and exhaled slowly. She had not spoken much that morning, choosing instead to move through each task with intention. Feed. Hydrate record, final weights, check permits, brace herself. Reed Calloway arrived just after 7, dressed in full field gear, thick green Ranger canvas fleece lining, visible beneath the collar, and his hair tied back loosely at the nape. He looked rested but serious. Slung across his chest was a small leather satchel containing tranquilizer kits and tracking chips in case the release needed emergency aid. Maren didn't ask if he'd brought them out of precaution or habit. He just always planned for worst-case scenarios. "Truck's ready," he said. Voice low. "Crates are secure." Maren replied. They didn't need to say more. Accompanying them that day were 2 members of the West Ridge Conservation Authority, a man named Lewis Hanley, mid-40s, solidly built, a practical type with short-cropped brown hair and deep-set eyes that rarely blinked, and Naomi Serrano, a soft-spoken wildlife biologist in her early 30s, with long black braids tucked into a gray beanie. Naomi had kind, intelligent eyes behind round glasses and moved with a quiet elegance that suggested she was more comfortable among animals than people. "They're in great shape," Naomi said, after examining the bobcats through the mesh. "All 3 juveniles are alert, and the mother shows excellent maternal behavior. You've done something extraordinary here, Dr. Ashford." Maren gave a small smile. "I just gave her the chance. She did the rest." They loaded the 4 crates gently into the back of Reed's truck, each lined with straw and scented fabric from the enclosure to reduce stress. As the engine rumbled to life, Toby Winthrop came running up the road, still zipping his coat. "I made it!" he shouted breathlessly. Maren met him at the back of the truck. "You're just in time." Toby climbed onto the side rail and looked into the carrier that held the runt, now as large as her siblings, but still with that small, crooked tail. "Will they be okay out there?" he asked. "They'll be wild," Maren said. "And that's exactly what they're meant to be." Toby nodded solemnly, then pulled something from his pocket, a feather white with gray flecks, one of Nimbus's. He slid it into the corner of the crate gently. "For luck," he whispered. The drive to Cedar Hollow took over 2 hours, winding through forest roads that grew more narrow with every mile. Mist clung to the windshield, and pine branches brushed the truck sides as if in gentle farewell. Conversation was sparse. In the cab, Maren stared out the window, her thoughts a slow tide of memory, of wounds stitched and eyes watched, of trembling new breaths and tiny claws hooked into fleece. By the time they reached the clearing, the mist had lifted into golden fog. The land was untouched, an open stretch framed by old-growth trees, mossy rocks, and a narrow stream that glinted like silver thread. No roads, no sounds of man, just birdsong and the wind. Naomi and Lewis checked the perimeter. One last time, then gave a quiet nod. Reed stepped beside Maren as she unlatched Juniper's crate. His hand brushed hers, and when she turned, he held out a small object, a pendant carved from dark wood, worn smooth from age. Etched into it, nearly faded, was the profile of a lynx mid-stride. "My mom wore this," he said quietly. "Said it was for strength. She gave it to me the year Cal died. I never wore it. Thought it was bad luck." Maren closed her hand around the pendant, but now Reed looked toward the trees. "Now I think it just needed the right moment." She nodded, her eyes hot with gratitude, and tucked the pendant into the pocket of her coat. With one long exhale, she opened the crate door. At first, nothing. Then Juniper stepped forward, slow and deliberate, her body stretched, long, lean muscle flowing under her coat like shadow and light. She paused at the threshold, sniffing the air, ears twitching. Then she looked back, not at the forest, at Maren. The moment held silent, sacred. Then Juniper turned and walked into the underbrush. One by one, the kittens followed. The largest bounded forward. The cautious middle one crept close to his sister's heels. The runt paused, blinked once at the humans watching, and then disappeared into the trees. The ferns closed behind them, and they were gone. Maren stood motionless, hands still on the open crate door. The air felt changed, emptier but fuller too, like something had been returned to the earth, and in doing so, had given part of itself to the people who had carried it. "Think they'll stay together?" Lewis asked quietly. "No," Reed said, shaking his head, "but they'll find their own ways. That's what wild families do." As they packed the crates and supplies, Maren looked out into the trees. One last time, fingers wrapped around the wooden pendant in her pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. Whether it was meant for Juniper, Reed, Walter, Hemsley, or the earth itself, she wasn't sure. Maybe all of them. Spring settled into Everpine, not with a sudden flourish, but with a slow, deliberate breath, like the forest stretching its limbs after a long sleep. The pines wore brighter greens, the rivers shed their icy shells, and the air held the clean scent of damp earth and waking life. At Pinefall Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Maren Ashford sat at her desk, a soft April breeze fluttering through a cracked window beside her. Her office, once sparse and practical, had slowly transformed. A potted wild fern now curled near the windowsill. A hand-drawn calendar marked with patient doodles from Toby hung by the filing cabinet. And on the wall above her desk, framed in rustic wood, was a new photograph, captured by a motion-triggered night camera set up by the West Ridge team. The image showed Juniper in profile beneath a moonlit canopy. Her body was sleek and strong, ears high, gaze focused on something beyond the frame. Behind her, barely visible in the silvery grass, trailed three smaller forms, her cubs still growing, but unmistakably wild. The picture radiated both distance and triumph, freedom. Maren had stared at it for days before finally framing it, placing it where she could see it every time she reached for her stethoscope. The clinic was quiet that morning, the kind of gentle lull between emergencies and appointments. Nimbus, now nearly full-grown, was in a rehabilitation aviary behind the building, his once damaged wings strong enough to carry him from perch to perch. Toby had built small elevation platforms for him to practice vertical flight. The boy still came daily, though his stories had become more elaborate now, involving Nimbus as a guardian of hidden forest temples. Around 10 o'clock, the doorbell jingled lightly. Maren looked up to see Toby stepping inside, his cheeks flushed and his eyes wide with purpose. Behind him was a girl slightly younger, with a round face and thick glasses that slipped down her nose. She had long auburn hair and 2 uneven braids and wore a corduroy jacket 2 sizes too large. Dr. Maren Toby called out, "This is Elsie. She's my neighbor, and we brought someone." Elsie smiled shyly, then held out a box with careful shaking hands. Inside, wrapped in a faded baby blanket, was a young red squirrel. Its eyes were still closed, body small and curled like a question mark. "He fell from the nest," Elsie said, her voice barely louder than the flutter of wings. "I think he's really hurt. My brother wanted to leave him, but Toby said you'd help Maren cross the room," and knelt beside her, examining the tiny creature gently. "Looks like he's a week old. No broken bones, just very cold and dehydrated. You did the right thing bringing him in." Elsie's face crumpled slightly with relief. Maren turned to Toby. And I take it you've been teaching wildlife rescue. Toby straightened with pride. Only the basics. Maren stood carefully taking the box. All right, you two can help me prepare a warming nest. We'll keep him in the incubator for a few days until he stabilizes. As they bustled into the back room, Maren couldn't help but marvel at how the clinic had changed. It had become more than a place of treatment. It had become a bridge between the wild and the small hearts that wanted to care for it. Later that afternoon, as the children fed the squirrel formula from a dropper, a familiar knock echoed on the side door. Reed Calloway stepped in, holding 2 coffees in gloved hands. He looked more relaxed than Maren had ever seen him, his jacket unzipped, sunglasses propped lazily on his forehead. The beard had been trimmed, but the scar on his wrist remained a silent signature of where he'd been and who he'd become. I heard there was a squirrel situation, he said, setting down the coffee. Maren smiled. News travels fast in Everpine. I ran into Toby's grandma at the market. She said he looked like he was hiding treasure in his coat. Reed looked around the clinic, his eyes pausing on the framed photo of Juniper. She looks good, he said. All of them do. Maren followed his gaze. They do. Reed pulled something from the inside pocket of his jacket, rolled blueprints tied with twine. I've been thinking, he said, unrolling them across the front counter, about something permanent. The designs were rough but clear. A modular wildlife rehabilitation center, modest in size, expandable, built into the edge of the pine line just outside town. It included isolation rooms, flight cages, a medical bay, and an educational wing for student outreach. At the top corner was the handwritten name, the Juniper Refuge. Guess I can pull permits. Reed continued. The land's zoned for conservation use. And I already talked to Naomi from West Ridge. They'd partner. You'd be lead vet? Maren stared at the paper, speechless. And I'd be the guy who brings the coffee, Reed added, half smiling. Maren looked up at him, her heart full in a way that didn't ache this time. I think, she said slowly, it's time Everpine had something like this. He nodded. We'll build it together. Behind them, Toby let out a whoop of success. His latest squirrel-feeding attempt had gone perfectly. Elsie clapped her hands, beaming. Maren turned to see their small patient finally stretching his paws and making soft, chirping noises of contentment. Another wild thing brought in from the cold. Another small life finding a place to begin. Sometimes God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light, but with silence, like a wild bobcat curled in a dumpster, or a child holding out trembling hands to save a creature no one else saw. In the quiet corners of our lives, when we choose compassion over convenience, when we open our doors to the broken, the small, and the scared, that's where grace finds us. Juniper wasn't just a wild animal. She was a whisper from creation, a reminder that healing begins not with control, but with kindness, that even the fiercest hearts carry love, and that even the loneliest souls, whether furred, feathered, or human, can find their way home with a little faith. In your own life, you may not find a bobcat at your door, but you will find someone in need of care. It may be a neighbor, a lost child, or even a piece of yourself. You've forgotten how to love. So, today let this story remind you that small acts of mercy matter, that every open hand is a prayer, and that the wilderness we fear sometimes holds the greatest gifts from God. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, hope, and the bond between humans and the creatures we're entrusted to protect. And if you believe in second chances and silent miracles, write amen in the comments below. May God bless you for every act of kindness you carry, even the quiet ones.